Hello and welcome to a La Trobe Asia seminar. This semester, our topic is Asian Studies in Focus. And today we're very privileged to be joined by Dr. Bernard Keogh, who's a lecturer in Asian history at La Trobe University. Thank you for joining us, Bernard.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you for inviting me to present in the seminar series. Before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respect to their elders past and present. Australia always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I might kick things off and hope everybody actually brought something to eat, because one of the drawbacks of working on this project is that it often leaves me peckish. And wanting to take a flight straight back to Malaysia to consume some hawker food. So hopefully some of you have some snacks ready to sort of assuage that very real thing that happens to me. The other thing that I should also flag is that this project is in its very beginning stages, and it's more of a proof of concept based on the research material that I currently have available rather than anything concrete in terms of conclusions. So I'd appreciate everyone's suggestions and comments as much as I welcome questions about the project. Yeah, I guess should I just launch straight into it, Matt, or do we need to do anything additional?
My internet dropped out just for the space of time that you were talking, Ben. And now
that's all good. I just did sort of acknowledgement of country and sort of just a quick intro.
Okay, you've done the acknowledgement of country. Look, I'm just going to let you roll. I will be back in the last 15 minutes, as Bernard has said, probably to take questions from you and to read them out to Bernard. And I look forward to hearing your seminar, Bernard. Off you go.
Thanks, Matt. So in this header image that you can see for the title slide is a few of the hawker stalls that adorn Lorong Baru or New Lane, which is a pretty unassuming thoroughfare just off Jalan Macalister or Macalister Road, which is this major roadway that connects the center of Georgetown with the rest of Penang Island. I decided to start off my talk with this image for a couple of reasons. In the first instance, it's actually one of my favorite places to go whenever I'm back in Penang. And this is the part where I give full disclosure that I was born and raised in Penang. So my food-related opinions are a little bit biased when it comes to Malaysia versus Singapore. But if anybody here goes to Penang, I would really recommend going to the Char Kway Teow stall just down the street from here. Or for those that are a bit more adventurous, you can try the chichang chok, which is a congee with deep fried offal. The other reason I picked this image is also because it provides this contrast to the model of the Singaporean hawker, who tends to be located in a designated static space in a hawker center rather than on or near the street, which I'll come back to later in the talk because I think it's an interesting kind of divergence. My talk today is an overview into my current research project, which focuses on the social history of hawkers in Malaysia and Singapore as it attempts to trace their changing fortunes from the 19th century to today. Hopefully that, all right. So one of the things that I've noticed since I started work on the project is there seems to have been this kind of explosion in popular interest in hawkers and hawker food over the last few years in particular, not just in Malaysia and Singapore, but beyond it as well. I'll talk a little bit more about the global sort of connections of hawker food later on in the paper, but just wanted to share that I saw this ad for the Hawker 88 night market at the Queen Victoria Market in Melbourne over the last month or so. And don't worry, I wasn't sort of like, I saw this on a billboard while I was driving, but I didn't take the photo while I was driving. This is just a screenshot from the internet somewhere. I just thought it was a bit serendipitous that I was going to give the talk sort of roughly around the same time when this was happening, because I think it just finished yesterday night, actually. So I thought I should include it. But onto the actual kind of focus of the presentation and the project. So in 2016, Singaporean hawker Chan Hong Meng, pictured here with his award-winning plate of soy sauce chicken, became the first street food vendor to be awarded a coveted star from the Michelin Guide. Subsequent media coverage and social media attention resulted in the development of an international franchise dubbed Hawker 10, which now includes outposts as far afield as Australia, the Philippines, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Thailand. Even before Chan's accolade in 2016, hawker culture in Malaysia and Singapore had contributed to the development of the global reputation of both countries as must-visit destinations for casual foodies and gourmands alike. Just as a quick update, I should also mention that Chan Hong Meng unfortunately lost his Michelin star in 2021, but there has since been another hawker in Singapore, Tang Chei Seng from Hill Street Thai Hua Pork Noodle, who has been awarded a Michelin star, while a few others have been awarded the Michelin Bib Gourmand, which, from as far as I can tell, is basically just a runners-up medal to the Michelin in the Michelin Guide. Nevertheless, the salient point to take away from this is that the commodification of hawker culture in recent years as a heritage tourism product by the Malaysian and Singaporean states for global consumption, with the latter going on to actually nominate hawker culture for inclusion on UNESCO's representative list of intangible cultural heritage, stands in stark contrast to the traditional role of the hawker as a provider of cheap, fast, and accessible food that has previously catered to working class tastes. And historically, during the colonial and immediate post-colonial period, hawkers were also oftentimes seen as an embarrassment to best laid plans for creating modern societies and modern cities. And this perception of hawkers has really undergone this quite dramatic shift in recent years. So the kind of key questions that I'm asking as part of this project is what accounts for this dramatic reinvention of the image of the hawker? How and why did this process take place? Has this translated into tangible improvements for the social status of hawkers, or is this a cynical attempt by authoritarian states to exploit them as a cultural commodity? What can studying hawkers tell us about continuities and changes of Malaysian and Singaporean society over time? So being an historian by training, I guess I wouldn't really be playing to type if I didn't at least provide a chronology of events before discussing the core arguments. So bear with me as I take us through a very rushed history of hawkers in Malaysia and Singapore. So one of the things that's quite popular in popular understandings of the history of hawkers is that they tend to be seen as a discrete phenomenon that emerged in the aftermath of World War II as entrepreneurial individuals with limited prospects for employment turned to street vending to eke out a living, as these photographs from the late 19th century attest to. Hawkers actually have a more storied history. In fact, the long history of hawkers in Malaysia and Singapore can be traced back in the archival record to the large-scale importation of laborers from China and India into British Malaya in sort of the mid-19th century by the British colonial government to address skyrocketing global demands for tin and rubber. Just as a very quick note before continuing, I should say here that I use the term British Malaya as a shorthand to refer to Malaysia and Singapore during colonial rule. Taking advantage of the development of a substantial customer base hungry for a taste of home, many Indian and Chinese migrants, some previously having worked as cooks, some with knowledge and experience as home cooks, others with no experience at all. Many of these entrepreneurs took up new careers as street food sellers, serving quick, cheap, and filling food to time and cash-strapped laborers. It should be said, though, that even if the historical record of hawkers is rather thin before the mid-19th century, it's almost certain that the general practice of selling food on the street extends much further back than that. The other thing worth noting in relation to the early iterations of hawkers is that it wasn't just a profession taken up by Chinese or Indian migrants, but something that was practiced by Malays native to the peninsula, as well as a range of Indonesian sub-ethnic groups from across the Indonesian archipelago. To give you a sense of the kind of diversity of hawking during the 19th century, I want to read out a short excerpt from Our Tropical Possessions in Malay and India, which is an 1865 travelogue by John Cameron, who was a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society, who in describing Singapore explained that, quote, "There is probably no city in the world with such a motley crowd of itinerant vendors or wares, fruits, cakes, vegetables. There are Malays, generally with fruit, Chinamen with a mixture of all sorts and clings, or Indians, with cakes and different kinds of nuts. Malays and Chinamen always use the shoulder stick, having equally balanced loads suspended at either end. The clings, on the contrary, carry their wares on the head on trays. The traveling cook shops of the Chinese are probably the most extraordinary of the things that are carried about this way. They are suspended on one of the common shoulder sticks and consist of a box on one side and a basket on the other, the former containing a fire and small copper cauldron for soup, the latter loaded with rice, vermicelli, cakes, jellies, and condiments. One interesting change over time that I've noticed from going through the research material I've managed to gather so far is the changing meaning of the term hawker over time. While we might associate it today with street food culture specifically, hawking and hawkers of the 19th century, and likely before that, were associated with the general practice of street vending by mobile shopkeepers who would sell everything from fresh food like vegetables and meat to household items like brooms, pots and pans, to staples like oil and rice to clothes. One particular hawker that seemingly captured the imagination of the Singaporean press at the time, because there were multiple articles written about him in the 19th century, was a Malay gentleman who would walk his cow around town and sell fresh milk on demand, which sounds like a pretty good service to me, actually. So returning to our focus on street food sellers, hawkers of this variety inspired considerable anxieties within the British colonial government, who viewed them as particularly insidious as a threat to public health from very early on. Within a global 19th century context of increased emphasis on public health and sanitary conditions, colonial health authorities viewed these eateries, typically mobile stalls set up on roadsides like the ones pictured here, are the ones that were carried on sticks as described by John Cameron. They were seen as unhygienic and thus a threat to the health of the colony. with the majority of blue-collar workforce in British Malaya dining at these establishments, civil servants in the health department feared the possibility of large-scale outbreaks of foodborne diseases, which would grind the economy of the country to a halt. Other colonial government departments also took issue with the hawkers, as they were unlicensed itinerant enterprises that didn't abide by regulations on trade and commerce, and they also oftentimes acted as a traffic obstacle whenever they stopped on a curbside and customers gathered around them. To give you some indication of how antithetical hawkers were to the colonial state, in 1937 alone, Singapore police issued 17,000 citations against hawkers for, quote, violating market regulations, end quote. These regulations have been put in place on both a federal level with the Hawkers Act passed in 1903, as well as on the municipal level with amendments made in 1906 to the Municipal Ordinance of 1898, both of which were designed to manage existing hawkers through a system of licenses and standards and to stem the growth of the number of hawkers as the population of British Malaya expanded exponentially during the early 20th century. Alongside their counterparts in the health, police, and municipal departments, colonial urban planners also viewed hawkers in a distinctly negative light, as their continued presence posed a challenge to the modernist vision of urban society they're attempting to impose in the great port cities of Penang and Singapore. These renderings of the hawker as public menace was not solely colonial. It was also continued in post-colonial settings by the independent Malayan and self-governing Singaporean states, which perpetuated this view that hawkers were impediments to the achievement of a post-colonial vision of modernity. So despite best efforts, both the colonial and post-colonial states in Malaysia and Singapore were not really able to deal with the hawker problem. Street food became this kind of ingrained phenomenon in everyday life for Malaysians and Singaporeans, which resulted in a transition towards forms of accommodation rather than attempting to get rid of them outright. In the Singaporean case, we've seen this process of centralization of hawkers away from the street and their relocation to large static spaces called hawker centers, as well as the introduction of licensing requirements and hygiene and food preparation standards that govern how hawkers ply their trade. In the Malaysian example, while requirements differ depending on state jurisdiction, the general trend has also been towards licensing and the imposition of regulatory frameworks, though it should be said that enforcement for Malaysian hawkers is less consistent than for their Singaporean counterparts. The other major distinction with Singapore, of course, is that hawkers can often still be found on the streets in Malaysia rather than in hawker centers or other locales. Like the other more informal institutions of food provision in Malaysia and Singapore, like the kopitiam or mamak stall, the major appeal for hawkers is that they provide convenience for both eating in and eating out. Given the low cost and speedy preparation, hawker food oftentimes serves as a staple for time-poor Malaysians and Singaporeans who will tapao or bungkus, take away food to eat at home. On the obverse, hawkers are also oftentimes spaces for socialization as people lepak or hang out after work or on the weekends over a selection of hot meals and cold drinks with football matches playing on a big screen more often than not in the background. Perhaps one of the most interesting elements of hawker culture, to me at least, is how they've become kind of ubiquitous within the social fabric of both Malaysia and Singapore. Yet their presence has largely been taken for granted, as reflected by the low prices that continue to be charged for hawker food, which means that most hawkers, with a few notable exceptions, really only break even and earn just enough to eke out a living. The contrast is particularly stark when drawing comparisons between a plate of hawker food, which can be purchased for about $5, $5 Australian dollars, whereas the same dish served at a restaurant would cost nearly triple or quadruple. Which brings us to this kind of modern phenomenon of the way in which hawkers have now pierced the kind of global imagination. So even prior to the first Michelin star being awarded to Chan Hong Meng, hawker culture has been part of this process of commodification in not just Singapore, but parts of Malaysia as well, predominantly Penang, and also in many places with significant Malaysian and or Singaporean diaspora. This has been part of an increasing emphasis on encouraging domestic, regional, and international tourism in Malaysia and Singapore, which in turn has been driven by broader initiatives by both nation states towards economic diversification. Beyond the phenomenon of hawkers being repackaged as cultural heritage products, which has been the primary emphasis of the limited scholarship that's been produced thus far, I argue that it's also kind of important to examine the flow of hawker food internationally as part of Malaysian and Singaporean nation branding. A couple of examples that I thought I'd point out because they represent the interesting ways in which hawker food has been repackaged and commodified into more middle-class fare. Two of these are Australian examples. One of them is American. So on the left of the slide, you can see Hawker Chan, which that's actually the Melbourne branch. And it's now, as I said earlier, full-blown franchise. Next to it is a place in Manhattan. which is called Urban Hawker, which has transplanted the Hawker Center to Manhattan as a kind of concept restaurant, is how they describe themselves. In a similar vein, the third photo from the left is of Hawker Hall, which is also in Melbourne on Chapel Street in Windsor, specifically, a food and beer hall that its proprietors describe as, quote, drawing inspiration from the vibrant hawker centers of Singapore and Malaysia, end quote. So all these places have made approximations of hawker food available outside of Malaysia and Singapore, but at a significant markup in price, which kind of contradicts the whole concept of hawker food, but that's a discussion for a different time. Alongside larger and more upmarket venues, there's also an increasing number of smaller businesses like Malaysian, Singaporean, or Pan-Asian restaurants and eateries that trade on the reputation of hawker food in marketing themselves. This has been particularly interesting for me to observe living in Melbourne, as more established Malaysian and Singaporean restaurants have reoriented their offerings towards more fast casual hawker-style meals, at the same time as new eateries increasingly also include the word hawker in their name. So the ways in which the Malaysian and Singaporean states have appropriated street food and hawker culture into commodities can be understood on a couple of different levels. Belying their contentious historical attitudes towards hawkers and their offerings as obstacles to a modernist vision of post-colonial society, both nation states have reimagined hawker culture as this authentic air quotes, expression of quintessentially Malaysian and or Singaporean cultural heritage. In so doing, they have effectively crafted new narratives that redefine the figure of the hawker, not as a threat to the future, but as a kind of living legacy that should be celebrated for keeping tradition alive. This idea of authenticity raises a number of difficult questions about not just what is and is not authentic, but also who gets to make these determinations as to authenticity. Alongside the notion of authenticity, which is primarily marketed to an international audience, the Malaysian and Singaporean states have also put forward this romanticized conception of street food as this microcosm of both countries being multicultural success stories. I argue that this is a particular message that has both an inward-facing and outward-facing intention underlying it, creating this narrative of cohesion within what continue to be, as J.S. Furnival put so evocatively quite a while ago, plural societies, right? Like as in Malaysia and Singapore continue to be, they are inherently multicultural in the sense of demographics, but in terms of cultural coming together, that becomes a bit more tricky to kind of parse and work through in those kinds of contexts. While street food can certainly be understood as a means of inculcating inclusivity through the idea of a common heritage and simply through the social act of eating, this idealized vision obscures the fact that hawker fare can also exclude on the basis of dietary restrictions based on ethnicity and or religion. Consider, for example, practicing Muslims being unable to eat in many Chinese hawker stalls due to the use of pork products, or practicing Hindus having to avoid many Malay and Chinese hawker stalls because of the presence of beef products in the dishes that are being served at these places. Last but not least, I also contend that the co-opting of hawkers and street food as part of the Malaysian and Singaporean states can be read within this conventional exercise of nation branding as a means for authoritarian or semi-authoritarian, depending who you ask, governments to legitimate their rule. Embracing hawkers and street food can thus be read as the employment of soft power to project a more benign image to both a domestic and international audience. So what my work is attempting to do, what this project is really trying to do is understand, unpack, and problematize the nation brands deployed by both the Malaysian and Singaporean nation states in relation to hawker culture, which has become a major kind of area of advertising in their national tourism campaigns, which raises the question, I guess, of why examine both Malaysia and Singapore. Aside from the fact that I'm from one of the countries, which I've already given away, it makes a lot of sense to examine them in tandem, given they serve as logical data points for comparison, given their intertwined colonial and post-colonial histories. Alongside this, it's also an opportunity, I think, to interrogate long-held national mythologies about the points of cultural differences between the two countries, which are very much what I think are invented traditions that have only kind of come to the fore in the wake of separation of the two countries, more so than something that's actually inherent in Malaysia and or Singapore. One of the things that also motivated the project, alongside a shameless excuse to eat a lot of hawker food as part of my research, was the inscription of the Singaporean hawker culture on the UNESCO representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2020. This was kind of puzzling to me, especially because the description of hawker culture in the inscription could easily be applied to hawker culture in Malaysia, or really street food culture in many parts of the world, really, but that's a different story, and possibly a larger project down the line. And this was not just something that I noticed, but there was plenty of commentary at the time, although it seems to have died down since then, about why Malaysia and Singapore didn't necessarily put together a joint bid, given the intertwined nature of their histories and the fact that hawker culture in both places oftentimes have a shared kind of heritage and a shared lineage as well. So there is this kind of problematic nature of deeming hawker culture specifically Singaporean, but that's not just necessarily something that comes from the Singapore perspective. There's a broader question to be asked about the ways in which we deem certain things as national cuisines or as national kind of phenomena, when really they're much more expansive than that. And this fits into a longer trajectory also of questions surrounding Malaysian and Singaporean national identity, particularly in relation to common social and cultural practices that can be found across the Straits of Johor, and who or what get to be defined as either Malaysian or Singaporean or both. Such considerations have implications far beyond Malaysia and Singapore, highlighting the problems that emerge with the conception of cultural heritage being this kind of inherently intertwined phenomenon with national identity. So I'm going to move a little bit away from the primary focus of the paper, because I thought I would try and share some of the few stray observations that I've had from the preliminary research that I've conducted on other aspects of the broader project, particularly class, because I'm very interested in looking at hawker culture through the lens of labor history as well. One particularly striking narrative within contemporary ideas of hawker culture is the mythologization of street food as a kind of level playing field for consumers. It's this idea that hawker culture is egalitarian because everybody, regardless of socioeconomic background, eats hawker food in Malaysia and Singapore. Even if this is true, which I don't think it actually is, its meaning to a working class, as in hawker food's meaning to a working class person who can really only afford to eat at hawker centers and food courts because of the low prices, is very different to middle and upper class patrons who eat hawker food sometimes as an act of transgressing class boundaries. And as an aside, I also find the idea of hawker food being a social leveler a bit amusing, because we oftentimes describe various things as social levelers. So sports, music is oftentimes defined as a social leveler as well, which I think there's a kind of mythologization around various cultural practices as social levelers. So it's just another thing that's added to the repertoire of this is a social leveler. The other notable disjuncture that emerges when studying hawker culture through the lens of those making the food is the tension between the figure of the hawker being a source of national pride and receiving international acclaim as a cultural heritage tourism product, while at the same time being considered as not a particularly desirable career by the people who are actually in these professions. While many hawkers themselves do express a sense of fulfillment in their profession, it is striking how few of them want their children and grandchildren to carry on their legacies, and conversely, how few young people are willing to take up hawking as a profession, especially in the last couple of years. This has resulted in a distinctly aging population of hawkers, which is borne out by data provided by Singapore's National Environment Agency, which is the body in charge of regulating hawkers. And they calculated in 2020 that the average age of hawkers was at 59. While I don't have equivalent figures from Malaysia, I would suspect a similar statistical trend, but obviously I'll do further research to confirm that observation. And there's plenty more research I need to do before drawing any definitive conclusions on why this is the case, but it's likely much of the reason why there isn't generational continuity in hawking is that it still remains a low-paid profession that requires long, grueling hours in oftentimes uncomfortable conditions, which is something that's often taken for granted by the many Malaysians and Singaporeans who consume hawker fare regularly. As you can see in these two articles that I've screenshotted from Channel News Asia, hawkers also face new pressures, like the rise of new technologies like social media and delivery apps, which they struggle to tap into, as well as the changing taste of younger generations, all of which have impacts on their already narrow profit margins. And as you can see, the kind of in the image above that article above, part of the issue that's very contemporary right now is the cost of inflation crisis that we're all kind of experiencing. And Malaysia and Singapore are not they're also exposed to inflation, the cost of living crisis. And one of the bigger questions is with regards to how hawkers are able to maintain their operations, given the fact that their prices are expected to remain low, because that's the expectation of hawker food, but the price for them purchasing raw materials to cook in ingredients to cook into these dishes are going up, and there are sort of like other considerations about in terms of paying their assistants, how much to pay their assistants, and questions like that as well. The other area that I'm particularly interested in examining is the geography of hawker culture. So in the first instance, as I briefly talked about earlier, one of the problematic claims in the romanticization of hawker culture is it's kind of seen as inherently multicultural, and it's inherently inclusive, while not taking away the fact that it can certainly be inclusive, and that hawker food oftentimes brings together a range of cultural influences in its cooking, as well as being enjoyed by people from various communities. It's also worth acknowledging that in many instances, it can be quite exclusive as well. In both Malaysia and Singapore, you can observe particular patterns of geographic distribution of hawkers that cook particular kinds of foods along ethnic and religious lines as a result of dietary restrictions. One prominent example of this phenomenon is Geylang Serai Hawker Center in Singapore, which is pictured in the first image at the top, which features hawkers that sell Malay and Indonesian cuisine and caters mostly to Singaporean Malay customers. Continuing on the issue of race, there's also the tricky question of who gets to prepare which cuisine, which was an issue that came to the fore in Penang, my hometown, about a decade ago now, when the Penang Island City Council banned foreigners from working in hawker stalls in order to what the government defined as the island state's food heritage. But that this is also a question that recurs in Singapore due to the lack of similar restrictions, with lots of Singaporeans lamenting the loss of authentic local hawker cuisine because it's now being prepared by foreign cooks rather than local cooks. And going back to the kind of earlier point I was making in the previous slide about class, it should be noted that there is also a stratification in the hawker profession in and of itself as well. While it may seem obvious, I don't think there's much acknowledgement within the general population about the distinctions between hawkers that continue to sell food on the street and those that sell food in hawker centers. Where they apply their trade is dependent on financial resources, particularly as the cost of renting a stall in a hawker center, as well as paying for utilities like gas, water, and electricity, eat into what are already oftentimes meager profits, leading to some hawkers practicing their trade more like their mobile forebears from kitchens on wheels. This is mostly applicable to Malaysia and a little bit less so to Singapore, given the hawkers are almost always located in hawker centers in the case of the latter. That being said, it's worth also discussing the considerable differences in the types of hawker centers themselves that exist in both the Malaysian and Singaporean context, as well as internationally, as I briefly alluded to earlier. One interesting new trend is the creation of upmarket hawker centers in Malaysia and Singapore, like the New Work Park Food City in Penang, which is the third image from the top, and Makan Sutra Gluttons Bay in Singapore, as well as food courts serving renditions of hawker food in shopping malls across both countries. One particularly interesting example, struggling to find a adjective there, is Singapore Food Street in Changi Airport, which you can see in the final image at the bottom, which is a very upmarket hawker center with static stalls designed to look like a street with faux colonial era shop fronts that provides a very sanitized rendition of what they call iconic street food from Singapore. These spaces are significantly different in terms of aesthetic and clientele when compared to long-standing establishments that are a little bit more kind of authentic, shall we say, like Chaurasta Market in Penang or Old Airport Road Hawker Center in Singapore. Something also reflected in the differences in pricing for similar dishes served in regular and upmarket settings. And finally, something that has bugged me for a very long time from a linguistic perspective, but I don't really have any real academic sort of conclusions or arguments or thoughts about. Aren't hawker centers kind of an oxymoron, given one is about mobility and the other is about immobility? Just a philosophical conundrum for some of you to potentially think about and give me suggestions on whether or not that's a productive line of pursuit in this project. And so just to wrap up my talk for today, I thought I'd just summarize a few key points I'm describing as tentative conclusions, as there's plenty more work to be done. As I said, this is a very early kind of first look into the project, which is still being developed and still being kind of worked upon at this juncture. So any comments or feedback would be really helpful. But basically, I don't have anything definitive at the moment. So these are just tentative concluding thoughts to wrap up the paper for today. So in the first instance, I think there's a need to understand the phenomenon of hawkers being appropriated by the Malaysian and Singaporean nation states as commodities for the global tourism market through the lens of nation branding. In recasting hawkers as living embodiments of Malaysian and or Singaporean cultural heritage, both nation states are engaging in an interesting pattern of historical revisionism designed to sell particular ideas about themselves to both a domestic and foreign audience. In essence, what I'm trying to do is make the case that hawkers have been integrated into broader campaigns to legitimate political rule and project more benign images of both Malaysia and Singapore. The other major intervention I hope my work contributes to is problematizing the kind of attempted monopolization of hawker culture as either quintessentially Malaysian or Singaporean as a means of recognizing the shared heritage of both countries and to engage in a broader interrogation of the practice of considering cultural heritage as inherently tied with national identity. I should also kind of say that this is the end of the serious part of the discussion. I felt bad not including more pictures of food, so I decided to include a bunch of pictures of my favorite hawker foods, and I'll take you through them before I end the slide and we can sort of go into Q&A. So clockwise from the top right, the one on the top right is apam balik, which is a kind of crepe filled with crushed peanut, sugar, and sweet corn, and sometimes condensed milk as well. The one just below that is kari mee, which is a coconut milk-based broth with noodles, tofu puffs, prawns, blood cockles, coagulated blood, and a spicy chili sauce. A lot of people will know as laksa, actually, in Australia especially. Asam laksa, which is what I know as laksa, which is a broth with thick rice noodles made of pureed fish. Hokkien mee, which is the one just below that. That's a a broth with thick rice noodles made of pureed. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Hokkien mee, which is a prawn-based broth with prawns, eggs, beans, sprouts, and vermicelli. To its left is otak otak, which is a kind of fish paste made out of a mixture of spices steamed in a leaf. Wonton mee, which is the one on top of that, which is egg noodles mixed in dark and light soy sauce with wontons, leafy greens, barbecued pork, and pickled chilies as accompaniment. Above that is nasi kandar, which is a rice dish with a variety of curry, sauces, and other accompaniments, and pai tea, which is a crunchy pastry shell filled with turnips, carrots, and topped with fried shallots. Hopefully that didn't make everybody too hungry. I'll stop there. Thank you, everybody, for coming along to the talk and for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. I should stop sharing my screen now.
Yeah, sure. Yes, please take the food away. I think you've made everyone very hungry. I'm not sure if it was good or bad to hold this just after lunch, but thank you very much, Bernard. That was a fascinating, and I'm slightly rattled that you keep saying these are not finished thoughts. These are all tentative and everything, when it seems very well thought out. But we've got a couple of questions that have come through, and I have some of my own. So people, if you've got questions for Bernard, please pop them in the Q&A or the chat, and I'll try and flag them. Firstly, we've got a question from Anuband who says, what is your opinion on the Greenfield city plans? And I'm not too sure what that is, but which attempt to either sanitize or formalize or territorialize hawkers. For example, the plans of Putrajaya. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, Putrajaya. So that's the administrative capital of Malaysia, which moved away from Kuala Lumpur. When did it happen? Anyways, no, that's a really great question. And so one of the things that I often try to think about in relation to this, and it's not just something that's happening in Malaysia, and obviously historically it's happened in Singapore with the transition away from hawkers on the street or in parking lots and stuff like that being moved into hawker centers. But we're starting to see this not just in Malaysia, which is kind of going down the same route. So Penang, again, hometown where I'm from, we see a lot of this happening, is this kind of replication of what happened in Singapore of moving hawkers away from the street and into sort of like more static hawker centers. And there's good arguments to be made in terms of sanitation and sort of like hygiene, but it's an interesting conundrum because another case study that I'm not working on at the moment, because I don't feel like I have the kind of language skills to do this, but something that I've been interested in is with regards to the ways in which street food is being handled in Thailand, for example. A couple of years ago, Bangkok basically made the Bangkok City Council basically made the decision to not have street food anymore, which is not really a thing that you can actually do in the sense that unenforceable rules, but increasingly we're seeing this kind of attempt to move these places into more more static, more controllable spaces. So on the one hand, I can see the argument from the sanitation perspective and why that's good. But on the other hand, I'm a little bit cynical and view it through the perspective of the ways in which it's been something that various states in Malaysia and Singapore, like successive states, like colonial and post-colonial, but also as we see in sort of lots of other places there, where it's basically a means of enabling regulation and enabling sort of state intervention into these kinds of practices. So I guess like my response is I have a sort of weird relationship to these kinds of planning, because on the one hand, I like urban planning as a kind of like, one of the reasons why I got into this is because I'm interested in the urban planning aspect of this. But on the other hand, I'm also just like, this is a kind of attempt to kind of impose state control on what is an interestingly less, what do you call it? Formalized means of doing business and serving food, right?
Yeah. And I'm glad that you pointed out in your talk the oxymoron of hawkers. I kind of don't get how you can translate something that seems to be so transient in its very historical nature of it, and still call it hawkers and say that no, this is the same kind of concept, even though you're in like a fixed venue with regulations and that sort of thing. And it seems to be just restricted to food as well. It's no longer about wider goods and services. But we've got a question here. This is from James Leibold, who says, fascinating project and interesting presentation. Is it possible to write a subaltern history of hawker culture in Malaysia and or Singapore? If so, what sort of historical materials would one draw upon?
Yeah, thanks for the question, James. So one of the things that inspired the project as well was a quite famous book in sort of Southeast Asian studies circles, which is Rickshaw Coolie, which is from Jim Warren, which is basically looking at sort of rickshaw pullers in colonial Singapore and sort of like doing a subaltern history of that. So one of the things that I've been really hoping to do as part of this project, alongside the more macro state level stuff, is I really do want to explore the histories of hawkers themselves, like their lives and their kind of experiences with the changing ways in which the state has regulated them. So one of the things that I was hoping to do as part of the project, but that's sort of, again, the broader project is still kind of at its infancy, was to do oral histories with lots of hawkers and sort of like get a sense of what their perspectives are as well. Because one of the things that I find fascinating, despite the fact that hawkers are such a major component in the popular consciousness, is that very few people actually talk to the hawkers themselves, or at least academically. There's a lot of great blogs and sort of like vlogs and sort of like videos of people talking to hawkers, but in terms of academic study, I haven't really seen much in terms of that. In terms of other kinds of materials, one of the things that I've been finding really productive is reading through newspapers from various kinds of contexts in terms of the way that they report on these hawkers. And sometimes you actually see the voices of the hawkers themselves, in the sense that in some of the kind of like primary source newspapers that I've gathered, you can actually see some of the journalists actually sort of putting questions, especially, this is mostly in relation to the 1970s and sort of Singapore's attempts to centralize hawker trading and move them into hawker centers. You see a lot of newspapers do some excellent investigative journalism where they actually ask the hawkers, what do you think about this? Or what are some of the kind of issues you have with this kind of thing? So it's definitely one of the things that I would love to look at as part of this. It's just I haven't quite reached that point of figuring out what else to do with the project. It's a very big project, and I hope that it's going to be a kind of long-term, multi-year project. But it's definitely something I've been thinking a lot about.
So one question here, this is from Deborah Ong. What are your thoughts on the increasing franchising and the concurrent use of central kitchens in Singaporean hawker centres and food courts? And what are the broader implications for the national food culture? There's quotation marks there. I guess this comes into something that I was thinking about broadly when you were talking about how there's like hawker restaurants overseas, and there's that in Melbourne as well. What culture are they exactly retaining and playing on when they're changing so much of what we think of as
I get complicated feelings about all of this in the sense that it's one of the tricky things about working on something that you've actually sort of like experienced, right? Like this is something I'm interested in because I grew up in Malaysia and I grew up in Penang specifically. So I have a sort of like very close personal relationship to the topic. But in terms of the kind of franchising and use of central kitchens, I'm not... I also feel bad commenting on stuff to do with Singapore because like I have an obvious bias being Malaysian, and I often get into fights with my Singaporean friends about my thoughts about these kinds of things. But I will say is that one thing that I often come across when talking to Singaporean friends about this, and sort of my own thoughts about this as well, is that on the one hand, you do have to see this kind of evolution in the sense that that's the kind of like food that's the food service industry in general, is that you're seeing all these like new developments like apps and stuff like that, and they can be quite productive means by which lots of hawkers develop their business further, right? In the sense of franchising means that they can kind of earn much better living than they just operate their single stall in the hawker center. On the other hand, yeah, there are all these kind of tough questions and sometimes problematic questions about is it authentic if someone else does the cooking? Is it authentic if a foreign cook rather than a sort of Singaporean or Malaysian cook does the cooking and stuff like that? So I have a kind of ambivalent relationship with this kind of thoughts about this, but I'm also very, as some of you might have worked out, as someone that mostly works in the history aspect of things, I struggle to do like future projection kind of stuff and sort of like making comments on those kinds of things. But it's an interesting conundrum, and I guess it kind of relates to one of the questions I saw in the Q&A as well about sort of like the decline or aging out of cultural heritage. Again, one of these things that's interesting for me is that a lot of this is kind of like invented tradition stuff, not just in the sense of the fact that this is appropriated by states to sell particular ideas about themselves, but also in the sense that a lot of the food that we see in hawker culture is basically stuff that emerges from the kind of cosmopolitan plural societies that Malaysia and Singapore represent, in the sense that all this food is in some sense native to the region, but in other senses draws from longer historical traditions of like, Indian cuisine, Malay cuisine, Chinese cuisine. So I think there's a complex answer with regards to what is actually authentic and what is not authentic as well. Like that's the other kind of like conundrum as part of this.
Okay, so one question which is from an anonymous attendee, so I think they're looking for tips. Could you expand a bit more about how hawkers are skillfully avoiding state interventions and governmentality?
Great question. It's something that I want to explore further as well, but I would imagine just this is a kind of anecdotal view rather than something that's been done on serious researches. I think there are just lots of ways to get around surveillance and sort of like regulation, especially in Malaysia. In Singapore, it's a little bit trickier because of the kind of like very highly regulated means by which the hawkers have now been placed under state control. So part of it is sort of the historical attempts by the Singaporean state to manage the hawker problem, which is interesting because that's the terminology that they used to use in relation to hawkers. And then since sort of like the 1990s, when tourism becomes more of a major aspect of the Singaporean economy, it's like, yeah, they're not a problem. They're stuff that we can work with, right? But on the other hand, you also see the kind of like 2020s, it's now become part of the UNESCO National Heritage List, International Intangible Cultural Heritage List. So Singapore has a very vested interest in maintaining standards and maintaining all these kinds of things. It's a lot easier in Malaysia to get away with sort of state intervention into these kinds of things because the state is weaker. Like not in the, I'm not saying this in a negative sense. I mean this in sort of like, it's much harder to manage a massive country as opposed to a tiny island city-state, but also the Malaysian federal system has tensions with state governments and local governments, and that becomes an interesting way in which hawkers can avoid this as well by sort of like working through the different jurisdictions. And I should give an example also of the Penang kind of like foreign cooks issue. There were a lot of interesting ways in which people navigated around this, whereby they would like designate the person, their foreign cook, as like a assistant chef rather than the actual chef, even though they're doing a lot of the cooking. So like there are kind of like even small ways to kind of get past it. And I would imagine there's also lots of other kind of surreptitious ways, drawing on kind of the terminology of James Scott, like weapons of the weak that all these hawkers can try and exploit and appropriate. But it's a great question and something that I would like to explore further as well.
So a question here from Dirk Thompson. The arguments you were making about national identity and soft power confined to hawker food. I remember a few years ago, there was outrage in Indonesia when Rio Ferdinand called nasi goreng local Singaporean food. Could hawker food be seen as one peculiar example of a broader argument you could make about food and national identity in Southeast Asia?
Thanks, Dirk. Great question. So I think it's not, I don't think it's confined to hawker food, but I think hawker food is a really great kind of microcosm of it, right? So I don't think the argument I've been trying to conceptualize in my brain, and now I've shared with all of you, is that it's sort of unique to hawker food, but I think it's a great representation of this. This is a bit of a side thing, but on the Dirk's comments about Rio Ferdinand calling nasi goreng local Singaporean food makes me remember this episode, which is slightly tangentially related to hawker food, from a couple of years ago when a British MasterChef judge decided to refer to rendang as one of the contestants was Malaysian and provided a rendang for the chefs to taste, and one of the chefs was like, I don't mind this, but like rendang is actually usually fried, and then everybody in Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia, which is the first time in our collective history, I think, we've come together as three separate national identities to be like, yeah, no, the British person is wrong, which was correct. The British person was wrong. But yeah, it just made me think of that. That was a funny moment in global food history.
Okay, we've got a good question here. Do you see any ideal outcome for hawker future that avoids the decline of aging out of this cultural heritage? What can customers, citizens, or governments do to help? So how do you keep it authentically hawkish?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm very bad at doing sort of like forecasting, but I think one of the things that is necessary is for us to actually pay hawkers more for the food that they're providing, right? Like, as that kind of Channel News Asia article that I highlighted pointed out, this is a kind of acute problem in terms of inflation, but there's been a longer term issue that I've often thought about with regards to the fact that, for example, I can pay 12 ringgit for a plate of chicken rice at a hawker stand, but then if I go to a proper restaurant, it would cost me like 36 ringgit, so like triple the price. So same ingredients, same kind of care taken into preparing the food, probably same level of deliciousness. Arguably, I would say the hawker version is usually more delicious. But the fact is that we don't pay hawkers enough. And so I'm not really sure what the solution is, but I think there needs to be a kind of societal change with regards to the way that we remunerate hawkers for the work that they do. And the other thing that's also worth talking about in terms of dealing with the issue of aging out is that I think we do need to deal with the thorny question of, lots of people complain about the authenticity of hawker food in the sense of, oh, it has to be a local Malaysian or a local Singaporean cooking this. And I don't really buy into those kinds of arguments. Like, on the one hand, yes, it makes it more authentic in some way or the other, but like if these cooks who are getting older and struggling to do the work are increasingly higher-end foreign cooks, what's really the issue with it if it's the same kind of food, like the same techniques, the same kind of ingredients, the same processes and stuff like that? I don't necessarily see that as a problem, but obviously I'm kind of the minority on that one. Most of my friends also tell me that I'm insane for suggesting that foreign cooks should cook hawker food. But yeah, I think there needs to be lots of societal messaging in terms of increasing how much we pay hawkers, and also sort of changing perceptions on like who is a hawker and who should be allowed to be a hawker.
It's a very hard sell, I think, when the cheapness of it is such an integral part of what the perception of hawking is. So yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, so if there's no more questions, we might wrap up. Eleanor says hello, and her snack of the day is a cheesecake Kit Kat. Yeah, she's rating the Japan supplies. So yeah, if there's no more questions, okay, we're done now. Thank you everyone for coming along and listening to Bernard. Thank you, Bernard, for a very fascinating seminar there, and some great questions from the audience. And thank you very much for the engagement. Next week, the seminar that we have on will be how women talk about women in Japanese politics. And that is with Emma Roberts, who I believe might be in here somewhere. Emma Robertson, is that right? And coming up later on, we'll have seminars on Ma Yifu and his understanding of Confucianism. That will be on the 1st of June. And then on the 8th of June, we'll be having a seminar on the politics of Indian history, which both seem to be very kind of interesting topics. So you can find out more about those on the La Trobe Asia website. And oh, sorry, Emma, it's not you, it's Emma Dalton who will be presenting that one. Sorry to put you on the spot. You're not, I'll let you out of that one. You're not presenting that one. So if everyone could thank Bernard virtually and send him all your well wishes over emails. I'm sure he'd appreciate that. Thank you very much, Bernard, for a very interesting seminar.
Thanks for hosting, Matt, and thanks everyone for the questions and comments. I really appreciate it.
Okay. All right. Bye, everyone.